How's it going, guys? It's John here from Hot Hockey, and if you're new, please subscribe, drop a like, and let's get right into the video. So the Edmonton Oilers have just fired Peter Chiarelli, and now it's time for us to discuss who could possibly replace him as GM. And you're probably thinking, it's kind of a tire fire here in Edmonton. It's not looking good. Players in the bottom six, their defense is lacking. They don't have a starting goaltender. All of that, yeah, it looks like a problem. But you still have Connor McDavid. You still have the best player in the world. You still have something to work with. And if you're a GM coming in, just like if you guys were watching in Canada, Brian Burke joined Tim and Sid to talk about any veteran that knows what he's doing can come in and build around a guy like Connor McDavid and can do well. Obviously, Todd McLellan and Peter Chiarelli, when they got hired, when McDavid joined this team, they were expecting a lot of success right away. That hasn't happened except for the one playoff run where they made it to the second round. But now it's time, with Ken Hitchcock as the head coach, for a new vet, someone that knows what he's doing, because as we've seen with Peter Chiarelli, that's definitely a controversy. So let's talk about 5 potential candidates that could replace Peter Chiarelli and become the new GM for the Edmonton Oilers. So there's been some talk about Mike Gillis. I don't know if that's a fit. I don't know if that would happen. Darren Dreger brought up possibly getting Daryl Sutter off his farm out of retirement. I don't see the fit in that as well. Another possible candidate, I'm not going to include him in my top 5, is Judd Brackett. Judd Brackett is actually the guy from Vancouver that was a prime reason in drafting Elias Pettersson. So he's the director of scouting. He drafted Pettersson. He was the reason for drafting prospects Demko, Gaudette, Hughes, Wu, etc., etc. So he's got quite the resume. There's been some chatter about him possibly being connected to the GM job in Edmonton. But my 5 candidates are going to be veterans, people that have experience in building a championship or a successful playoff team. Or for this one prime example, I think you guys will know my connection to it and why I think it's such a solid reason. But let's get to our 5 candidates. So my first candidate is Dean Lombardi. Yes, the LA Kings obviously were a franchise that had so much success, Stanley Cup championships. Dean Lombardi built the contender, built the team with LA. He's a veteran hockey exec, and he previously served as Sharks GM prior to joining the Kings. So 2 experiences with Western Conference teams that had success. Maybe he could come to the Edmonton Oilers and build a playoff and Stanley Cup team around Connor McDavid. He's an example. Another example is Mike Fuda, who actually worked with Dean Lombardi. He is a mainstay in the Los Angeles Kings organization since 2007. He joined LA as a director of amateur scouting, worked his way up to VP of hockey ops and director of player personnel before being named assistant GM following the 2016-17 season. Obviously, like I just said with Dean Lombardi, the Kings won 2 cups since Fuda was hired, and his extensive experience in the OHL prior to making the leap into the NHL makes him an intriguing contender for any GM vacancy. I'm actually reading this right out of the Sportsnet article because out of my 5 candidates, they have 4 of them listed here. So another candidate would be, who was just let go from the Philadelphia Flyers, Ron Hextall. So Hextall, obviously, who played a long, successful career as a goaltender, built a pretty decent team, in my opinion, with the Flyers. Just for some reason, and you could blame goaltending with the Flyers, maybe a lack of defense on the back end, but for me, the Flyers built a pretty good stacked team there, and I just couldn't put it together. But I would say Ron Hextall, in terms of building a pretty solid team and up and down the lineup, up and down your organization, because that's definitely another example of why the Oilers have struggled. They haven't built anything from the bottom. Besides guys like Caleb Jones, Evan Bouchard, they just don't have a system with the Condors. They don't have a system at all. So that's another example, and I think possibly he could find success. Another example is Kelly McCrimmon. He's a guy now with Vegas. The Leafs wanted him when they were starting their rebuild, starting their transition with Austin Matthews, Mitch Marner, William Nylander, and co. McCrimmon was a guy that they wanted. He was an integral part of the Brandon Wheat Kings, and now an integral part of the Golden Knights, and why the Golden Knights have become so successful. Obviously, the Golden Knights, who drafted players like Brandstrom and Suzuki, McCrimmon was big in those decisions, and obviously in the roster structure of just the team itself, possibly being back-to-back playoff contenders and Stanley Cup contenders again. So McCrimmon could be a candidate for the GM job in Edmonton. And my final one, who I think deserved a GM job by now. He has ties with the London Knights. Obviously, a guy like Evan Bouchard just previously worked with the Toronto Maple Leafs in the NHL. Mark Hunter. I honestly think this guy could be a serious GM candidate for the Edmonton Oilers. Drafted Mitch Marner. There was a lot of, not hate around it, but there was a lot of question about drafting his London Knights boy. Mitch Marner, look at the guy he's become with the Leafs. Mark Hunter arguably is one of the best scouts in the NHL. And this is where people might argue with me in the comments or argue with me after, that he is just a scout. But then he took on the role with the assistant GM with Kyle Dubas, and the best moves that the Leafs made in terms of trades, in terms of draft picks, were made when those two guys were at the helm. When Lou Lamoriello was there, he kind of just transitioned the team after the moves were already made. And great, Lamoriello and Babcock did great things. But if you look back at all the Leafs moves, they were made when Mark Hunter and Kyle Dubas were working together. So, overall, I think Mark Hunter could be a great GM, or at least head scout for the Edmonton Oilers. The scouts have been a huge problem for Edmonton. So at least hiring Mark Hunter in some kind of seniority executive role could really help this team. Again, maybe he's not fit for a GM, but he's a serious candidate to help this team for the future. And I think Brian Burke, another thing that he brought up on Tim and Sid, is that a GM would need 6 years. If himself, and actually, I honestly think Brian Burke could be a decent, and a lot of people might hate this, but if he was interested for the Edmonton Oilers, because besides the Kessel thing, Brian Burke actually did a lot of positive things for Toronto, and he actually did a lot of positive things for the Calgary Flames. Look where the Calgary Flames are now. Again, Brian Burke has gotten a lot of hate, but I actually think he's done a lot of positive things over his career. And you can look back with the Vancouver Canucks as another example. So for my opinion on the Edmonton Oilers, I do think that it is still an intriguing option for whoever can step in. And you know what? Everyone thinks it's a mess. Yes, it is a mess. You still have the best player in the world. You can't be a complete mess when you have a player like that. It's the same thing with any team. You could strip the Pittsburgh Penguins or Toronto Maple Leafs, but if you had a young Crosby or a young Matthews, you still have something to work with. You could still, and you've seen it with Crosby in the past, you've seen it with McDavid in the past, they create things out of nothing, and they can do things on their own. Yes, they wouldn't be able to drag a horrible team into the playoffs and for a Stanley Cup run, but you have something to work with, and with a leader and a captain like that, you can still do things at Edmonton. So that's just my take. As much as it's a mess in Edmonton, I still think that they have stuff to work with, and that this team can still, if not this year, for years to come, be a serious team that can do things in the playoffs with Connor McDavid. So thank you so much for watching this video, guys. More of a discussion again, but you heard my candidates, you heard my thoughts on where Edmonton possibly could take this. So please subscribe to the channel, drop a like. This is John from Hot Take Hockey. Have a good one. We'll see what Edmonton does in the future and for the rest of the year, because actually they're not that far out of the playoffs. We'll see what happens. All right, peace out.